Our first chapter in history talks about the rise of nationalism in Europe. Now here we need to have a little background about how Europe was during those times. It is not given in your textbook, but just to give you a little background. Entire Europe nearly was under the Roman rule or the Roman Empire. The last Roman emperor, that is Charlemagne. After him, we had feudalism. That means instead of having a powerful emperor, every area got split into small areas and you had a feudal lord who used to lord over that area. You might have done maybe earlier in history how they had their manor houses, how they had the serfs working for them. So the feeling of nationalism or nation state had not come about. People used to speak different languages. In Europe, they used to speak Spanish, they used to speak German, they used to speak French, and each area had their own language. They also had their own person whom they used to look up to, who was not their king. They didn't even know who their king was because he was somewhere far away. Their feudal lord who was in that area, they were familiar with him. Whether it was for justice, whether it was for financial help, they always went to him. So this feeling of oneness was not there. In this lesson, we are going to do how the feeling of nationalism rose. Now it starts off with the French Revolution. Okay, so let us see the French Revolution. Naturally, it took place in France. It took place in 1789. Okay, so we are going to learn today first about the French Revolution and then we'll go on to the other areas. Now again in your book, though they have not given in detail, let us again get a background as to why the French Revolution started in France. How was the system in France? France was divided, the whole society was divided into 3 estates. The first estate, the second estate and the third estate. Okay, so you had first estate, second estate and the third estate. The first estate consisted of the clergy. Clergy are those priests who are connected with the church. The second estate had the nobles. And the third estate had all the other people. That means whether it was the peasants, the artisans, the teachers. Okay, basically all the other people came in the third estate. The third estate was 95% of the French population and the clergy and the nobles were 5% of the population. Now, you can see here the clergy and the nobles are only 5%, but most of the land was owned by the church or by the nobles. Above them, of course, was the king. In France, they had the Burban Dynasty. The Bourbon dynasty ruled for a long time, one after the other, starting with Louis I, it went right up to Louis XVI. That is when the French Revolution took place. The first and the second estate used to be the privileged class. They used to enjoy a lot of privileges, they did not have to pay taxes, and maximum tax was borne by the peasants and the artisans and the poorer section of society, which formed 95%. So they had to pay the taxes and they used to enjoy the benefits and they didn't have to pay any tax. So naturally there was a kind of a revolt by the third estate against the first and second because they did not want to pay taxes. This French Revolution took place during the reign or the rule of Louis XVI, whose Queen Marie Antoinette was known to be Austrian, very proud of herself because she was very beautiful, and the people were very upset. So when they went to the Palace of Versailles to ask for food. They said, "We don't have bread." She said, "You don't have bread? You can eat cake." This is a very, very famous story, and that sparked the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a revolt of the Third Estate against the tyranny, that means the cruel rule against them, where they had to work hard, pay taxes, and not even get enough food. Now ideas of revolution started coming up, and they started getting ideas of what is known as la patrie. La patrie is the fatherland. And they wanted to be citizens of that fatherland. So they had the idea of le citoyen, or the citizen. As a citizen, they wanted rights. Just now they did not have rights because in France there was absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy means the rule of a king who has absolute control. He makes the laws, he breaks the laws, there's no one to punish him. In those days there was no checks and balance. Checks and balance like how we have a legislature, executive and judiciary, where one makes the laws, one implements the laws, and one sees to it that the laws are upheld. So those ideas also started coming during the French Revolution. Writers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, Voltaire, they wrote books in which they tried to bring about the idea of equality and the main idea of liberty, fraternity and equality. In French they call it égalité, liberté et fraternité. They started writing different hymns. Hymns were composed during that time. The most famous hymn is the Marseillaise. To garner the people together, that means all of them marched against the Bastille. The Bastille, or the prison of Bastille, and they marched and they broke the prison of Bastille. They released all the prisoners. The prisoners in Bastille were not regular prisoners. That means it's not like they were murderers or rapists or something. They were what you call political prisoners. They were the ones who raised their voice against the First and the Second Estate, and which is why they were put in jail. So they released all the prisoners, and there was chaos in France. All the people rising in rebellion. The hymn sung by them was also very rebellious. If you listen to their national anthem, which was written during that time, Marseillaise, Allons enfants de la patrie, le jour de gloire est arrivé. Today the people of France say that I think we should change our national anthem because their national anthem is very bloody. It talks about let us slit their throats, let their blood flow in the drain, let their blood flow in the gutter. So in those days they were so angry. You can imagine, because they were hungry, and naturally that caused the rebellion or the revolt of 1789 in France. Immediately after the revolt, what came about was the beheading of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette, that is the Queen. Beheading used to be done by guillotine. Guillotine, that means cutting off the head. So both the king and the queen lost their head, and they thought that now we'll have a republic, but it was not to be. Immediately after the French Revolution, there was a period known as the Bloody Period, when Robespierre came about. And immediately after that, we had Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was part of the military, and he was very ambitious. He came to power and he crowned himself the emperor. Okay, so now once Napoleon, but understand one thing, that though Napoleon was ambitious, he was good for France. Because as soon as Napoleon came about, he started what is known as the Civil Code. The Civil Code was started by Napoleon in 1804. According to this, there were certain rules that were made by him. There were to be no privileges based on birth. That means just because you're born in the family of a clergy or a nobleman doesn't mean that you will get any privilege. In the eyes of law, everyone would be equal. Everyone had the right to own property. They abolished the old feudal system where they had the feudal lords and you had the serfs who used to serve them. Standard weights and measures were made. So the businessmen were also very happy about it. And in general, everyone was happy. Earlier, the idea behind the French Revolution was to remove monarchy or despotism, and not just in France, but to help the people of other nations. That means in Europe, other countries also who wanted to become free and to create nations. But Napoleon, being ambitious, he saw to it that he sent armies all over. Of course, he wanted this code spread throughout Europe. So he sent his armies to Holland. Holland today is known as Netherlands, Switzerland, Brussels, Mainz, Milan, Warsaw, and many other places. First, in the beginning, the French armies were welcomed. Their ideas were welcomed. But later on, they started becoming a little hostile towards them. So you find that the French Revolution and the idea of the French Revolution spread everywhere. And what is the main motto of the French Revolution? Here we have in the French Revolution, equality, liberty, and fraternity. Okay, so this is what the French Revolution has given the world. Similarly, during Napoleon's rule, so this is Napoleon's civil code. In that, what were the points? No special privileges based on birth, equality before law, standard weights and measures. Okay, so all these things that he started was actually good. Okay, abolishing feudal system, and he also started what we call the metric system. Okay. The metric system made it very easy because now everything was in meters, kilometers, or grams, kilograms. Earlier we used to have pounds, ounces, which made it a little complicated to calculate. Okay, so here we have Napoleon, who became very ambitious, and he started going to all the different European countries and invading them with his armies. As we saw, first in the beginning they were happy about the new code started by them. During that period, there was also a Jacobin club which was started by the middle class. That was in between the two periods. That means just after the revolution and before the Napoleonic period. Now, the nationalism started spreading in Europe also. The way the French felt that we need to have a French nation, other countries like Germany, Switzerland, others will also feel that we should have a nation of our own. Germany, Italy, Switzerland, all these were divided into kingdoms, duchies and cantons. They used to have autocratic monarchy. Monarchy means king, and autocratic means who does whatever he feels like, whether he was cruel. Often they spoke different languages. All the people in each region and area, they didn't have any feeling of nationality or nationalism or the idea of nation, Rashtriyata ki bhavna, what we call, because there wasn't a common language that bound them. They all spoke different languages. For example, Habsburg Empire ruled over the Austria-Hungary region. Now here, you had people from Bohemia, you had German-speaking people, it had Italian-speaking provinces of Lombardy, Venezia today what we call Venice. In Hungary, most of them spoke Magyar, while the others spoke different dialects. Dialects are spoken languages which don't have any written script. In Galicia, the aristocratic people used to speak Polish. Or you had people who were Bohemians or Slovaks, and they all spoke different languages, some from Transylvania, some from Croatia. And all these different diverse groups used to be under one emperor. That was the Habsburg Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Naturally, they did not feel a kind of a oneness because they spoke different languages. The aristocracy and the new middle class. Socially and politically, a landed aristocracy was the dominant class of the continent. That means earlier also we saw the landed gentry, or those who owned the lands. They were the powerful people. The members of this class were united by common way of life. They owned estates. They spoke French for the purpose of diplomacy. French is considered to be a very elite language. It's a very beautiful, classy language. The families were connected by ties of marriage. That means a rich person will get married into another rich family so that they become richer. Majority of the population was made up of peasantry. That means the farmers, the small farmers. While in Eastern and Central Europe, the pattern of land holding was characterized by vast estates which were cultivated by serfs. Now, what exactly are serfs? Serfs they are landless laborers. They are not exactly slaves. They were not bought and sold, but they did not have land of their own, and they worked on the land owned by these aristocrats. In western and central parts of Europe, growth of industrial production and trade meant the growth of towns and the emergence of commercial classes whose existence was based on production for the market. So industrialization started first in England. To give you a little background again, why did it start in England? England had plenty of colonies all over the world, more than 50 colonies. They used to get their raw materials cheap from there. They had labor which was cheap, and it was during this period that there was peace in England. Peace, of course, helps to progress. Instead of destruction, there is construction. Lot of different things were invented in England which helped them to make spinning faster. Even the locomotive, that means the transportation by trains and locomotives, was started. England was blessed also with plenty of coal, which is needed for these industries, and therefore you know that the birthplace of industrialization was England. So England was the first country to start industries. Later on in France and German states, it occurred only during the 19th century. That means maybe 100 years later, industrialization took place in other places in Europe. As soon as industrialization started, there were different classes which came about. Businessmen, industrialists, professionals. In Central and Eastern Europe, these groups were smaller in number till 19th century. That means in the 18th century it only started in England, so there were not so many. Then in the 19th century you had a totally new class of people. It was among the educated liberal middle classes that ideas of unity followed the abolition of aristocratic privileges and gained popularity. So this aristocracy who owns land, their privileges should be removed, and this middle class, this was the educated class. Okay, so they came up and they started new ideas where they felt, why should they have the privileges based on birth? Now, what did liberal nationalism stand for? Ideas of national unity in early 19th century Europe were closely allied to the ideology of liberalism. Allied means connected. So it was connected with liberty, liberalism, free thinking. The term liberalism derives the root from Latin, which means libre, that is free. For the new middle class, liberalism stood for freedom for the individual and equality of all before the law. In the Napoleonic Code, we have already seen that we saw equality in the eyes of law. Okay, but here they were also looking for freedom or liberty, liberalism. Politically, it emphasized the concept of government by consent. Consent of the people. People will vote for the government. That means there will be a republic. There won't be a monarchy. Since the French Revolution, liberalism had stood for the end of autocracy and the privileged class, and a proper constitution should be made, and based on that, the parliament will be chosen and the government will be run on the basis of election. People will choose the elected members. 19th century liberals also stressed that there should be inviolability of private property. Private property, that is, right to have property. Equality before the law did not necessarily stand for universal suffrage. Now, what is the meaning of suffrage? The right to vote. Women were not allowed to vote during that time. The serfs were not allowed to vote. People who did not own any land, that means only the landed gentry could vote. So really speaking, it was not equality. Political equality did not exist. Then social equality also did not exist. Economic equality also was not there. So what equality? But in the eyes of law, everyone is considered equal. You will recall that in revolutionary France, which marked the first political experiment in liberal democracy, the right to vote and get elected was granted exclusively to property-owning men. Men without property were not allowed to vote, women were not allowed to vote, because they thought if you have property, you pay property tax. You pay your tax, that is your duty, and therefore you get the right. Only a brief period, if you remember I told you about the Jacobin clubs which were started by the middle class, all adult males were allowed to vote, but that was just a short period. Napoleonic Code went back to limited suffrage. That means that reduced women also, from that they were cut out. Those who are minors, of course, are not allowed to vote, and only if their fathers and husbands allowed it, then women had any rights. Throughout the 19th and the 20th century, women and non-propertied men had no suffrage or did not have the right to vote. In the economic sphere, liberalism stood for the freedom of markets and the abolition of state-imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. During 19th century, this was a strong demand of the emerging middle class. Let us take the example of German-speaking nations or regions in the first half of the 19th century. Napoleon's administrative measure had created a countless small principalities. Principalities means little princely states, which was a confederation of about 39 different states. Each of them had their own currency. If you have to see a parallel in India, India also had 550 princely states when the British came to rule. So it wasn't one united country. So that you can understand, in a similar way, how over here, in one area, if you have 39 small little principalities. A merchant traveling in 1933 from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell his goods would have to go through 11 customs checks. I can quite imagine that. When I went to Europe in 1986, the currency had to be changed in every country. When we went to Italy, we used lira. When we went to Germany, we used Deutschmarks. In France, they were using French francs. In Switzerland, they were using Swiss francs. In England, they were using pounds. In Holland, we used guilders. Holland in those days, but now known as Netherlands. So in every country that we traveled, we had to keep on changing the currency. At every check post, we were checked. But today, now we have only one visa, that is the Schengen visa. In those days, only one visa was there for 3 countries, and that is Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Switzerland. I'm talking about when I traveled years ago. But many years before that, 100 years before that, you can imagine, if each place has a different currency, each place you're stopped at the check post. So when you are exporting anything from one place to another, it has to go through 11 check posts. Every time you pay octroi or you pay your duty, and finally that becomes very inconvenient. So they had to pass through 11 custom barriers and pay a custom duty of about 5% at each of them. Now, 5%, if you pay at 11 check posts, 55% you have paid at only the check posts. So what will be your profit? Duties were often levied according to the weight or measurement of the goods. Each region had its own system of weighing. Now here we have the metric system, at least there is one system. That means in every place, if it is 5 kilos, it will be 5 kilos. But if someone says it is so many ounces and it is so many grams and it's so many pounds, so they have different weights and measures. So it was very time consuming. The measure of cloth, for example, was the L, which in each region stood for a different length. Everyone knows that 1 meter is 100 centimeters anywhere in the world, but here an L could be 54.7 centimeters of cloth, that is in Frankfurt. If you went to Mainz, it was 55.1 centimeters. If you went to Nuremberg, it was 65.6 centimeters, and in Freiburg, it was 53.5 centimeters. So, how much exactly was 1 L? How to measure? It ranged from 53 centimeters right up to 65 centimeters. It was different in each place. Such conditions were viewed as obstacles. So, obstacle was a lot of checkposts, different currencies and different weights and measures. So, there was a new commercial class, that means the people who are traders, businessmen, and they will try to argue that let's have one unified economic territory, which so many years later has happened now. Now you have the euro currency, so that all of Europe uses one common currency. In 1834, a customs union, or the Zollverein, was formed at the initiative of Prussia and joined by most of the German states. The union abolished tariff barriers and reduced the number of currencies from over 30 to 2. That means there were 30 different currencies and now you had only 2 currencies. The creation of a network of railways further stimulated mobility, harnessing economic interest to national unification. So slowly, when transportation connected the people, the feeling of nationalism also grew. Also, there was more trade because now there were only 2 currencies. A wave of economic nationalism strengthened the wider nationalist sentiments growing at that time. So you can see how nationalism started growing. This is a background as to how it started growing in different parts of Europe. That means here we are talking more about the German-speaking states or the Austrian area. A new conservatism after 1815. Now Napoleon was defeated in 1815 in the Battle of Waterloo. You know that he was defeated by Nelson. European governments were driven by a spirit of conservatism. Conservatives believe that established traditional institutions of state and society like monarchy, church, social hierarchies, that means they liked all that. What Napoleon tried to remove, they went back. They felt that we should have a king, we should have different hierarchies. Hierarchies means the different classes that they had, the upper class and the middle class and the lower class. So they felt that that was very good, that should be preserved. Most conservatives, however, did not propose a return to the society of pre-revolutionary days. Of course, they were not going back to that era when they were thoroughly exploited. Rather, they realized from the changes initiated by Napoleon that modernization would in fact strengthen that entire society. It could make state power more effective and strong. Modern army had to be there, dynamic economy, abolition of feudalism and serfdom. So all these changes had to be brought about in the period of what we are talking, that is the 1900s, 1815 onwards. In 1815, representatives of the European power, that is Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, all collectively who defeated Napoleon, met at Vienna, and they drew up a settlement for Europe. Congress was hosted by the Austrian Chancellor, Duke Metternich. The delegates drew up the Treaty of Vienna in 1815. So, the European nations came together and signed the Treaty of Vienna. Okay, this was in Austria, this was in 1815. 1815 is also defeat of Napoleon. Some things that Napoleon had introduced they wanted to remove, and some things they wanted to change, they wanted to modernize it. They wanted to have a strong army, they wanted to have a constitutional system. So some things, and in some ways they were conservative. What was the object now? With the object of undoing most of the changes that had come about in Europe during Napoleonic wars. The Bourbon Dynasty which had been deposed during the French Revolution. The Bourbon Dynasty, we are talking about Louis XVI. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King. During his time, the Palace of Versailles was completed. And from then on, you could see how they lived in grand luxury, the Bourbon Dynasty or the ruling dynasty of France, and was restored to power, and France lost the territories which it had annexed under Napoleon. So Napoleon had managed to expand his empire, but those areas went back to those nations and they wanted to undo what Napoleon had done. A series of states were set up on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion. The Kingdom of Netherlands, in those days known as Holland, which included Belgium, was set up in the north, and Genoa was added to Piedmont in the south. Genoa was in Italy. Today, what we have, Genoa and Piedmont. Prussia was given importance, new territories on its western frontiers, while Austria was given control of northern Italy. But the German Confederation of 39 states that had been set up by Napoleon was left untouched. In the east, Russia was given part of Poland, while Prussia was given a portion of Saxony. The main intention was to restore the monarchies that had been overthrown by Napoleon. So, which were the different states that came up and became strong around France? So that French again do not try to expand, because after Napoleonic wars, they were a little frightened. So you had Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Russia, Prussia. Okay, so all these countries around, and of course you had Italy also around France, so that it can check that it does not try to expand once again. Conservative regimes set up in 1815 were autocratic. They did not tolerate criticism and dissent. Dissent means they did not like it if anyone spoke against them, and sought to curb activities that questioned the legitimacy of autocratic governments. Legitimacy means if people say, who gave you the legal right to rule? You continue to rule, your dynasty continues to rule. In olden days, they used to have what is known as the divine right of kings. Divine, that means given by God. So they used to feel we are answerable only to God. We don't need to answer to the people why we do certain things. So this right that they used to feel we had, that started being questioned by the people. Most of them imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays, songs, and reflected the ideas of liberty and freedom. Because the autocratic rulers will naturally want to continue to rule and continue to be autocratic, and they did not want ideas of liberalism and freedom to spread. Now, from where did they get these ideas of liberalism? From the French Revolution. The memory of the French Revolution nonetheless dominated. That means those ideas, once the seed was sown, people started wanting liberty and equality and fraternity as was given by the French Revolution. We saw about the revolution that took place in France, and now we also started having revolutionary feelings or revolutionaries in other places. Take the example of Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini was an Italian born in Genoa. This was in 1807. Now he felt that Italy was made up like a patchwork of different countries or states or principalities put together. It wasn't one country as such. So he started a secret society known as the Carbonari. Okay, this was the name of his secret society. Secret because he was a revolutionary, naturally it was not appreciated what he was doing. At the age of 24, he was sent into exile. Sent into exile at the age of 24. This was in 1931. Now, once he came back from exile, now why was he sent to exile? Because of the revolution that he started in Liguria. But when he came back, he started two more secret societies. So this was the first secret society, Carbonari, and then later on he started one more known as Young Italy. This was started in Marseille. Marseille, of course, today is in France, and Young Europe, which was started in Bern. So he started three societies. The Carbonari was the first society that he started. After he came back from exile, he started two more, that is Young Italy and Young Europe. Now he believed that God actually intended nations to be natural units of mankind, not patchwork and put together the way it was at that time. So what he was aiming for was the unification of Italy. He believed that Italian liberty can be gained only through unification. So he had two main aims, and what were his aims? Italian liberty and unification of Italy. Okay, Italy was divided into different parts, like you had Sicily, you had Piedmont, and different people ruling different areas. Now, influenced by him, there were other places also which felt, yes, we should have our own nation. Places like Germany, France, Switzerland, Poland, they all started having secret societies. In fact, Metternich has said that this particular person, that is Giuseppe Mazzini, he said was the most dangerous enemy of our social order. That means he will bring an end to our entire social order. Now 1830 to 1848 was considered as the age of revolutions. The first upheaval took place in France, we already saw that. And it is said that when France sneezes, everyone catches a cold. That means first it started in France, then of course it spread to other places like Italy, Germany and all. When France sneezes, Metternich said, the same Metternich who said that Mazzini was very dangerous for our social order, he said that once France sneezes, everybody catches a cold. Later on, they had what is known as the Romantic period. Okay? Now what is the meaning of Romantic period? Romanticism is a cultural movement which sought to develop a particular form of nationalist sentiment. So it has nothing to do with romance of boy and girl. Rashtriyata ki bhavna. Okay, that kind of romantic ideas they started getting. Romantic artists and poets generally criticized the glorification of reason and science and focused instead of emotions. That means your feelings. Intuition. Intuition, that means what you feel from within. And mystical feelings. Their effort was to create a sense of shared collective heritage and a common cultural past. There were lots of romantic writings, there were poems, and this idea of romanticizing nationalism spread throughout Europe. Now during the 1930s in Europe, they had to face a lot of, in 1830s, they had to face a lot of hunger, hardship and popular revolt. The first half of the 19th century saw an enormous increase in population all over Europe. That means population was increasing, the food was not increasing at that rate. In most countries, there were seekers of jobs, that means there was unemployment. And population from rural areas were migrating to the cities. Small producers in towns were often faced with competition from import because very cheap material was brought in from England, so they could not compete with that. This was especially so in textile production, which was carried out mainly in homes or small workshops, or what we call cottage industry or Gruha Udyog. Europe, where the aristocracy still enjoyed power, Peasants struggled under the burden of feudal dues and obligation. That means they owed a lot of money. They were in debt. The rise of food prices or a year of bad harvest led to widespread pauperism. Pauperism or poverty in Europe, especially in the towns and the cities. 1848 was one such year. Now from 1930 onwards, what were the different hardships faced by the people? Lack of food, migrating to go into towns, not getting jobs over there. The people who already live in the town find it difficult to sell their products because the market is being flooded with material which comes in from England, and that is much cheaper. So they found it very difficult to face that competition. And all these things were leading to hardships of the people. But 1848, the food shortage and widespread unemployment brought the population of Paris out on the roads. All the people came on the roads because of what they were suffering. Barricades were erected and Louis Philippe was forced to flee. That means he ran away. A National Assembly proclaimed a republic, granted suffrage to all male adults above 21. That means they were allowed to vote, and guaranteed the right to work. We have different rights. They wanted the right to be able to work. We want to work, but we can't find any employment. National workshops to provide employment were set up. Earlier, in 1845, weavers in Silesia had led a revolt against contractors who supplied them raw material and gave them orders for finished textiles, but drastically reduced their payment. That means they got work, but they didn't get paid much. The journalist Wilhelm Wolff described the events in a Silesian village as follows. Now this is what he wrote. In these villages, cotton weaving is the widespread occupation. The misery of the workers is extreme. The desperate need for jobs has taken advantage of by the contractors and reduced their prices of the goods that they order. Large crowd of weavers left their homes and they all came out asking for higher wages, demanding more pay. They were treated with scorn. Scorn means with contempt, with disgust, and even were threatened. Following this, a group of them forced their way into the house, smashed its elegant window panes, porcelain. Another group broke into another storehouse. They plundered, they looted. So you find that the contractor finally fled with his family to a neighboring village. He returned 24 hours later, having requisitioned the army. In exchange that followed, 11 weavers were shot. Now these weavers were only asking what was due to them. They needed the money to be able to eat. They did not have food, so they were asking for work. They were getting work, but after they were given work, they were not getting enough payment, and which is why all the weavers came on the streets of Paris. 1848, Revolution of the Liberals. Okay, so now you can see this entire period is a period of revolution. Parallel to the revolts of the poor, unemployed and starving peasants, the workers in many European countries, in the year 1848, a revolution led by the educated middle class was on its way. Now the previous revolution that we saw, it was the weavers, it was the peasants, it was the workers, while here we have a revolution which runs parallel to it during the same period, that is 1848, by the educated middle class. Events of February 1848 in France had brought about the abdication of the monarch, and a republic based on universal male suffrage had been proclaimed. In other parts of Europe, where independent nation states did not yet exist, like Germany, Italy, Poland, Austro-Hungarian Empire, men and women of middle class combined their demands for constitutionalism with national unification. So what were their demands? Now what is the difference? They wanted constitutionalism and they also wanted the national unification. Okay, in 1848. Okay, so you had two parallel movements going on. This is of the middle class and here you had the lower class whose main demand was right to suffrage and right to work, not just work, right to fair wages. That means they should be paid properly also. So both these were going on simultaneously, one by the middle class and one by the workers. So we have the revolt of 1848 running parallel. In the German regions, large number of political associations were formed. You had the German National Assembly, and in May 1948, 831 elected representatives marched in a festive procession to take their places in the Frankfurt Parliament, convened in the church of St. Paul. St. Paul is a very big church which is now in Rome. It has the biggest dome. St. Peter and St. Paul. So St. Paul is in England and St. Peter is in Rome. They drafted a constitution for a German nation to be headed by a monarchy subject to a parliament. When the deputies offered the crown on these terms to Frederick William IV, Wilhelm in German, King of Prussia, he rejected it and joined other monarchs to oppose the elected assembly. Now here when they had national unification and constitutionalism, here that means you will have one set of people who feel that we should have elections and we should have a proper constitution, and on the other hand, the monarchs of the different places will feel that we are losing our position of being the king. While the opposition of the aristocracy and military became stronger, the social basis of parliament eroded. The parliament was dominated by the middle classes who resisted the demands of workers and artisans and consequently lost their support. In the end, troops were called in and the assembly was forced to disband. That means they were told to go home. The issue of extending political rights to women was a controversial one. So now suffrage, when we said right to suffrage, that was given only to men. Women were still not given the right to vote. Women had formed their own political associations and founded newspapers and taken part in political meetings and demonstrations. Despite this, they were denied suffrage rights during the election of the assembly. When the Frankfurt Parliament convened in the Church of St. Paul, women were admitted only as observers. That means in the gallery on top, they could just sit and watch what was going on. Though conservative forces were able to suppress liberal movements in 1848, they could not restore the old order. Monarchs were beginning to realize that the cycles of revolution and repression could only be ended by granting concession to the liberal nationalist revolutionaries. So the kings realized that we will have to give them what they are asking for. That means they want constitutionalism and they want national unification. Hence, in the years after 1848, the autocratic monarchies of Central and Eastern Europe began to introduce changes that had already taken place in Western Europe before 1815. Western Europe, we are talking about France, that was the first country of course. Napoleon came to an end in 1815, and in 1815 the conservatives wanted to go back to pre-Napoleonic period, of course not to the pre-French Revolution period. That means they wanted a little modernism, but they wanted some things to remain conservative. That means they wanted monarchy or they wanted certain systems to remain in the same way. Habsburg dominions and in Russia were abolished. Over there, they did not have serfdom anymore. The Habsburg rulers granted more autonomy. Autonomy means self-rule. So in certain places, serfs were no longer ill-treated or they did not have landless laborers, and in some places they gave them autonomy or self-rule. Also, they gave universal suffrage to men, but not yet to women. Okay? And now, after this, we will see the making of Germany and Italy. We saw how ideas of nationalism grew, and here we see the unification of Germany. Now, the unification of Germany Actually, the leadership was taken over by Prussia. Their chief minister, Otto von Bismarck, was the main architect. He felt that he should bring all the German-speaking places together. Prussian victory over Austria, Denmark and France ended the process of unification. Now these three wars were fought over 7 years and finally Prussia proved that it was very strong. 18 January 1871, Prussian King William I was proclaimed the Emperor in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Later on, of course, you will learn the Treaty of Versailles signed after World War I was in the same place. That means in the Hall of Mirrors. So that brought about the unification of Germany, and other places were also convinced that they should also work towards unification. Bring people of a nation together, create one strong nation state. Feelings of nationalism, feeling of belonging, where all the people feel that they were one. Now here, the new state that was formed, they saw to it that they modernized their currency, their legal and banking systems, their judicial systems, and the Prussian measures and practices then soon became a model for all other German states. So we can see that Prussia was the first example, and then later on all these states came together. Now coming to the unification of Italy. Originally, Italy was divided into 7 different states. Sardinia, Piedmont was ruled by an Italian prince. The northern part was ruled by the Austrian Habsburgs, the center by the Pope, and the southern part or the southern regions by the Bourbon kings of Spain. To bring it all together was very difficult because in Italy, it was not that Italian was spoken by everybody. Italian or a dialect of Italian was spoken in different regions. So it's not like people felt that they were common. It had not acquired one common form and there were variations according to each area. Giuseppe Mazzini, we have already mentioned before, the one who started 3 different revolutionary societies. They were secret societies, and he also tried to create this feeling of nationalism. Later on, you had Chief Minister Cavour, who led the movement to unify the regions of Italy. Now, he was neither a Democrat nor was he a revolutionary. Giuseppe Mazzini, if you remember, was a revolutionary kind. Like many other wealthy and educated people, in fact, though he was Italian, he spoke French much better. Most of the elite used to speak French. Through a tactful diplomatic alliance with France, engineered by him, Sardinia-Piedmont succeeded in defeating the Austrian forces. Apart from regular troops, large number of armed volunteers under the leadership of Giuseppe Garibaldi. So we have 2 people who are very important in this period in Italy. One is Mazzini, second is Garibaldi, and of course you have Cavour, that is the chief minister. They marched into South Italy and the kingdom of the 2 Sicilies and succeeded in winning the support of the local peasants in order to drive out the Spanish rulers. If you look at the map, you can see the different divisions. You have Savoy, Sardinia, Lombardy, Venezia, today modern day Venice, Parma, Modena, Tuscany, San Marino, the Papal State, that was where the Pope was important, and both the kingdoms of Sicily, where you had the Bourbon kings from Spain. So you can see how all these different places were brought together and Italy was unified. Now, however much they did that, the problem was all these people which they brought together, as I told you, they didn't speak a common language. They were illiterate. Most of them were illiterate. They were not even aware about Italia. The funny thing is, they didn't know Italia is the country that they belong to. They thought the name was L'Italia and they thought that was Victor Emmanuel's wife. So they didn't even know that they belonged to one country. The peasant masses who had supported Garibaldi in the southern part, most of them didn't know about Italia. So those were the problems, even though it came together as one nation. Now here you can see the next place that came together. We know Great Britain or United Kingdom today. It has 4 basic different language speaking people. That is, you have the English from England, you have the Welsh from Wales, you have the Scots from Scotland, and you have the Irish. Now the northern part of Ireland is also part of Great Britain, or what we know as United Kingdom. Earlier, all four, because they used to speak different languages, they were not united. Then in 1707, the Act of Union brought them together. But they always felt that the English tried to rule over them, or they tried to suppress their language. So English was the language which was given more importance, and they felt that they were dominated by the English members. Scotland felt that we have a distinctive culture, we have a different type of language, we have different culture, and that is being suppressed. So the people from the Scottish Highlands were very upset about the repression. They were forbidden to speak their own language, the Gaelic language, and they were not allowed to wear their national dress. Large number of them were forcefully driven out of their homeland. Ireland also suffered in a similar way. Now Ireland had one more problem. It was divided into basically Protestants and Catholics, Roman Catholics. Both are Christians, but Roman Catholics give importance to the Pope, while the Protestants, if you remember, if you have done in history, the Protestant movement led by Martin Luther was a protest against the unfair practices going on in church, against the corruption in church, about the Pope. If you remember your history, if you have done Reformation period, so that was the period when you had two different sects in the Christians, that is Roman Catholics and Protestants. Now the Protestants were supported by England or by the English people, but the majority of people in Ireland were Roman Catholic. So there was a little tussle over that too. After England and Wales, Scotland, all of these came together to form the Union, they had to create a sense of nationalism. Now when they had a king, it was very easy to have a picture of a king, or you have the king on the coins. Even now on stamps and all, you can see Queen Elizabeth. Earlier you had Queen Victoria or King George V, even in the Indian stamps when we were being ruled by the British. But how do you have a symbol for nationalism? So the British used to feel that let us create symbols which will create a feeling of nationalism. So the first symbol was, of course, the Union Jack or the flag of England, or even symbols like their national anthem. God Save Our King is their national anthem, and they tried to promote the English language. That means a common language for all the four parts which form the United Kingdom. Now when you visualize the nation, as I said, it's very difficult to visualize what a nation is like. So we have these symbols. In most of the cases, you will find that a nation is symbolized by a woman. Even in India, we have what we call one image of Bharat Mata. The first such symbol or image was created in France, that of Marion. The symbol of liberty, equality, fraternity, when they gave those motto, and they called her Marion because that's a very common Christian name in France. Similarly, in Germany, they had Germania, and she used to wear a crown of oak leaves because the oak tree symbolized strength in Germany. So Germania was also a woman, and she symbolized Germany. So you'll find that even in India, when you have seen when they say Kanun, and you'll always find that there's a woman who's blindfolded and she's holding the scales of justice. Okay, so that is a symbol because we cannot actually show the nation. Now, after these nations were formed, we saw France, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, all these different nations were formed, carved out of what used to be one huge Roman Empire. Now they felt a sense of belonging, common language or common history or common culture brought them together. Immediately after this, you will find now we come to the 1900s. There was again a tussle. Yet all the nations have not started getting that feeling of nation state or nationalism, and the main problem still remained in the Balkan states. Now the Balkan states were made up of what we call modern day Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia, Serbia, Montenegro, And all these people together were commonly known as the Slav race. A large part of Balkan was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire were the Turks. Once the Ottoman Empire was no longer controlling it, the Balkan people wanted to claim their independence, their right, their political right, their right to nationality, and each one wanted to prove that their history shows that they have always been independent. They were never together. Okay, under the Ottoman Empire they came together and now they wanted to assert their independence. The Balkan states were also very jealous of each other and they hoped to gain more territory. That means when they become separate, each one wants to get more territory. These rivalries were very evident and the problem, of course, unfolded. In fact, it was one of the main causes of World War I in 1914. Russia, Germany, England, Austro-Hungary, all of them wanted a piece of the Balkan. The Balkan area was of strategic importance. It was very, very important to these nations which had newly formed, and that was one of the reasons why they had World War I. This led to a series of wars in the region and finally the First World War. Nationalism along with imperialism. Now imperialism means where each empire or each nation tries to expand their empire by getting more and more colonies. England, Germany, Portugal, Spain, all were in the race to get larger empires. Even Netherlands, even countries like that had come. It was literally like the world was a watermelon and they were all cutting it into slices and each one taking one slice, dividing the world into different pieces and literally eating it and spitting out the seeds. That is what happened to us. That is what happened in Indochina. In different places where you see nationalism began, because we felt anti-colonial, that means against the colonial rule of the British, because they were becoming imperialistic, they wanted to expand their empire, become more powerful, and they exploited us. Similarly, Germany also acquired many colonies in their imperialistic ambition. France also tried to expand in Indochina, also in a lot of regions in Africa. The Dutch also went to Indonesia, Java, Sumatra. So literally the whole world was cut up like a watermelon by these countries. And they started becoming more and more ambitious. Starting from being under one common empire, then having feudal lords, feudalism ended, each nation felt that we should bring about nationalism and creation of nation with a common language, sense of belonging, and then later on came the imperialistic part. After imperialism, naturally you will start seeing that in those colonies which they invaded or which they exploited, nationalism spread in those areas also. They wanted freedom from colonialism, freedom from imperialism.